Hello? Ah, there I was. Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Pelle Guldborg Hansen. I'm a behavioral scientist at Roskilde University, which is just outside of Copenhagen. I'm also the director of ISSP, the Initiative for Science, Society and Policy. And then I'm very proud to be chairman of the Danish Nudging Network, which is a network which comprises more than 80 institutions, organizations, and companies interested in the application of nudge theory. Like many other scientists and members of our network, I deeply care about many of the challenges that we face as society. We all know that we have some big challenges: the obesity epidemic, global climate change, productivity, and so on. And I really believe, as a scientist and as a citizen, that we can actually make significant contributions to solving these challenges beyond just developing more and more fine-tuned technologies. In my own field of applied behavioral science, we have recently seen a convergence between cognitive psychology, social psychology, and what is called behavioral economics. And during the last 5 years, there has been a particular sub-branch of that convergence called nudge theory, which has become one of the most influential ideas in public policy making and regulation around the world. Shortly, nudge theory is based upon the idea that with sound experiments and with behavioral insights, it is actually possible to change and influence the behavior of citizens and our own behavior as persons without limiting people's choices or fiddling around with incentives. In particular, this approach offers some relatively cheap interventions based on evidence that may inform future policymaking while respecting individual freedom as well as promoting the wealth, health, and happiness of citizens. So it's not surprising that the application of nudge theory is currently one of the hottest topics in public policy around the world. But this shift of paradigm hasn't just happened by coincidence. It has required somebody with knowledge, vision, and courage to introduce and pioneer its introduction into the policy world. And I'm here to present you to that person, our next speaker, Professor Cass Sunstein. Professor Sunstein is Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard Law School and is widely regarded as one of the most influential legal scholars in the world. He has an outstanding career with hundreds of publications whose impact extends well beyond law into the social sciences and the public sphere in many nations. Sunstein's work comprises 5 major areas: constitutional law and democratic theory, legal theory and jurisprudence, administrative law, and regulation of risk, and finally, behavioral economics and public policy. In 2009, Professor Sunstein accepted President Obama's invitation and was confirmed by the US Senate to serve as administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. In that time, he helped to implement the new healthcare law, promote the use of cost-benefit analysis, and initiate a number of major changes in national regulation, including large-scale reassessment of existing rules. He is also the founder and director of the program of behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard Law School. Besides his 100 academic articles, Sunstein has authored or co-authored more than 30 books. Some of us believe sometimes that Sunstein is actually the name of a publishing company somewhere in the world, but it's just one person. One of these books is the book Nudge: How to Improve Decision-Making About Health, Wealth, and Happiness. It was published in 2008 and co-authored with former colleague from Chicago University and one of the world's leading behavioral economists, Richard Thaler. The book argued that by using insights from applied behavioral science and scientific methodologies such as randomized controlled trials and quasi-experiments, it is possible to tailor policies in ways that promote the health of citizens, more environmentally sustainable behaviors, and simpler and more effective regulations. So to tell you much more about the idea of nudge and public policy, I would like you all to give a warm welcome to Professor Cass Sunstein.
Thank you, Pelle. Thank you. Thank you so much, Pelle, and thank you all for coming. I gather this is the last presentation, and I think I'm not going to play drums, though you'll hear drums soon. If you hear drums in the background, that's okay by me. Okay, here's a story from a novelist, David Foster Wallace. There are two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way. The older fish nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" The two young fish swim on for a bit. One of them looks over at the other and says, "What the hell is water?" I think this is a profound joke, because we are all, in a way, swimming in forms of water, and we may not notice it. And to identify it is important because it often influences our choices. So whether you live in Denmark or Germany or the United States or Australia or Kenya, there's water all around. And whether you live a long life or a short life, and whether you're prosperous or not, and whether the air is clean or the food is safe, there's water there. And it's good to identify why it is as it is. Okay, from 1960 to 2000, roughly, here are some standard views and prescriptions. Human beings are rational. So in the social sciences, in this period, probably the dominant figure, someone who recently died named Gary Becker of the University of Chicago, who emphasized the rationality of the human species. I've seen Gary Becker play tennis, and he is a very rational tennis player. Every shot is perfectly matched to his ability and knowledge. That's a conception of people. If human beings are rational, they calculate probabilities and maximize expected value. So if you're making an investment decision, if you're deciding what sort of energy choices to make, if you're buying a consumer product that may be safe or not, you are assessing the probability of harm. If there's anything that rational people are, it is that they are responsive to incentives. So the policy prescription, which has played a significant role all over the world, is improve incentives. If you are not engaging in behavior that is in your interest, if you're not purchasing enough of a product, the right thing for a private institution to do or a public institution is to improve your incentives. So if healthy foods are not being purchased enough, then the policy prescription is to make them less expensive. If certain products are causing environmental harm, then the right thing to do is to impose a corrective tax, which would make the incentive better. So take this, if you would, this slide, as a little analytic Bible, which was the kind of the Bible of policy analysts for about 40 years. Okay, starting in the 1970s, we've seen certain behavioral objections. The first is that human beings show present bias, meaning that they focus on the short term, and the future often seems like a foreign country. Call it later land, and it's not clear that they will ever visit. So one idea is that when we make choices, whether they involve our economic future, our environmental future, or our health, we are often very much focused on today. Possibly tomorrow, but unlikely to be in the long term. We also know that human beings are loss averse. They tend to hate losses from the status quo, and in fact, they dislike losses a lot more than they like equivalent gains. So if you're going to lose 10% of your income in the next year, let's have a little experiment. I'm telling you, I'm sorry to announce, you're going to lose 10% of your income in the next year. This isn't true, this is hypothetical. But if you were listening, there was a kind of shot of adrenaline maybe at that moment. That's a very painful idea. And if I told you you're going to gain 10% more next year, that probably pleases you, but it's less exciting than the prospect of a 10% loss is bad. Loss aversion is connected to what's called the endowment effect, by which people value the goods that they have more than they value goods that they could have but don't, which means that people's current set of endowments they hang on to ferociously, and while they might be pretty eager to get other endowments, there often isn't the same degree of ferocity. We could try a little endowment effect experiment in this room. If I gave you Copenhagen cups to this half of the room and asked, how much would you have to be paid to give up those Copenhagen cups? They're nice, they're royal blue. You'd probably demand a significant amount of money, and if the rest of you, I'm sorry to say, were not given Royal Copenhagen cups, but were asked how much would you be willing to pay to get such a cup, you'd offer a lower amount. And that's the lower amount from this group than demanded by this group is not because you over here tend to love those cups and you are not that excited about cups. It's just because you initially had the endowment. You were demanding an amount to give it up, and you were paying to get something you didn't have. We know that people don't deal very well with probability. The human species often gets confused thinking about probability. We know that about 80% of human beings are unrealistically optimistic. Most people think that they are safer than the average driver and less likely to be involved in a serious accident. Over 90% of college professors think that they're better than the average college professor. A very small segment of the population doesn't show unrealistic optimism. A small segment has a realistic sense of their prospects and of what other people think of them. And that group tends to be dominated by the clinically depressed. Normal, happy people are unrealistically optimistic. We also know that human beings have limited attention, which is, I think, a more intriguing statement than it seems. There are aspects of products and activities which aren't quite visible because people are focusing on some features and not others. So if you're buying a product or engaging in activity, if you're human, there are aspects of that product and activity that you're probably oblivious to. And that's because your attention is focused on certain aspects and not others. And magicians are able to exploit limited attention. That's what they do. And they succeed and often baffle people because they divert attention to here. And the fact that I have a rabbit, well, I don't, but if I were a magician, I would. If I were better prepared for this speech, I would have a rabbit. The rabbit would appear here, and you'd find it mysterious, but actually the rabbit was under there and you didn't notice because you were looking at the slides in my face. Okay, here are behavioral policy claims emphasized in the last decade. The first claim is default rules really matter. By default rules, I mean the rules that establish what happens if you do nothing. So your cell phone, your computer, your home, your city, your relationship with your employer is pervaded by default rules, which mean they establish what life is going to be like if you do nothing. And default rules tend to stick. Default rules are a nudge, and they are an extremely powerful nudge. They are water, and we often don't notice them because we live with them and don't revisit them. The fact is that social practices are as they are frequently just because default rules tend to stick, and they often could be otherwise. And if we wanted to make change while preserving freedom of choice, we'd just change the default rule. Incentives may not matter much. For an incentive to matter, and they frequently do, people have to know about them. And if there's an economic or material incentive, you're going to get money if you do this, or your health is going to be better if you do that, it may not affect you as much as the policy analyst thinks because you may not attend to it. Okay, choice architecture, and I'll say more about that in a moment, is both important and unavoidable. Choice architecture is for human beings water. Our choices are done against a background of choice architecture. There's no use in protesting its existence because we need to have something to live or swim in. The question is how to make it right. People can often use a nudge. I'll explain why in a moment. And simplicity is very, very important. Okay, here's a nudge. It's a little elephant, and I like to think that the little baby elephant has freedom of choice. He can go in the direction that he wants, but his mom is nudging him. There's a nudge. A GPS is a nudge. If you want, you can ignore the GPS, but it gives you a route that it thinks is a good one. If you want to get in the direction, and this is very important, that you seek, a GPS doesn't displace your goals or ends or values. It tries to find a way for you to implement your goals or ends or values. This is my only scandalous nudge, the only slide that is for adults or people who are, it's not as scandalous as it might be. The men in the room recognize this. This is a urinal. The women may or may not have seen one. If you haven't seen one before, that's a urinal. I'm proud to be able to show you what a urinal looks like. But this isn't just any urinal. This is a urinal from the Amsterdam airport, which has decided to paint a little fly on the urinal, not as an aesthetic or artistic endeavor. It's not particularly beautiful, but as a way of nudging men to aim a little bit better. And the consequence of the nudge at the Amsterdam airport has been to reduce spillage by up to 40%. Apparently, when men see the fly, they can't help but aim at it. And that is a clue about how to trigger people's attention in a way that can help with small problems and maybe larger ones also. Here's a little nudge that involves larger problems. That is organs that are available for people who need them because they're very sick. And what this chart basically shows is the difference between the percentage of people who make their organs available in countries where you have to opt in, like the United States, and in countries like most European countries where you are presumed to consent and you can opt out. You can see a startling degree of difference between the percentage of people whose organs are available in opt-in nations versus opt-out nations, and this has important public health consequences. What is significant about the chart is not merely the issue of organ donation, but the dramatic difference between nations where the default rule is opt-in and the nations where the default rule is opt-out. There's a large lesson there. By the way, if any of you works for a large institution that has a printer, one way to save money and to be environmentally a bit better is to change the default setting on the printer from single-sided to double-sided. That small change, that small nudge has significant effects in reducing paper usage. Notice that if the default setting is double-sided, you can, if you want, go single-sided. It's just a default. Okay, here's another nudge being used by some companies now in the United States. A lot of people don't save enough for retirement, and all over the world. And the reason is that their future self seems like an old person whom they may or may not ever meet. The nudge is to put people in a computer simulation by which they can see their future selves, which may be alarming or a bit of a relief. I've seen myself at age 100. It isn't that terrible. Maybe it's a kind computer program, but I'm going to be optimistic and think they've got it right. In the simulation, the way the experiment goes is you see your future self, and it's in a seemingly unrelated part of the experiment, you're asked how much you want to save for retirement. People who see their future selves want to save more. And the reason is that the simulation nudges people to think of their future selves as them rather than a stranger, and that has behavioral consequences. Okay, here's a little nudge with respect to healthy eating for diabetics. The idea is basically to have color coding, where some foods and drinks are red, some are yellow, and some, it's not on the slide, are green. And the idea is a simple color coding: red, be careful; yellow, drink occasionally; green, fine, has a very large impact. And what's notable about this nudge is its simplicity. We know from some studies that if you do this with food generally, not with diabetics for healthy eating, a simple color coding, you can have a big impact in nudging people in the direction of healthier eating. And notice it's very much like a GPS, where if people think what I enjoy most happens to be hamburgers and Coke, then they can completely do that. They'll just know that it's less healthy than, let's say, carrots and water. Okay, this is from the United Kingdom. This is an effort to nudge people to be donors. And they get a little card which says, I would like to help someone to live after my death. And the reason it's a nudge is it appeals to people's moral sense. Okay, this is something also from the United Kingdom, which is an effort to prevent people from being tax delinquents for too long. And the percentages get higher as people are informed not merely of what the social norm is, but also of what the social norm is in their community. So if you were told that you're engaging in certain behavior that is very unusual among people at this conference, not listening to this talk, by the way, is very unusual behavior. If you're not listening carefully, you're probably the only one. That should have worked. The statistics suggest that would work. That tends to have a large impact on people's behavior. People don't want to be outliers. I was in a coffee shop here a few hours ago where the coffee shop and bookstore, and it was great, had invited patrons to like the coffee shop on Facebook. And there's a question, why is the coffee shop interested in getting people who are enjoying their coffee to like it on Facebook? It's an intuitive appreciation that Facebook itself can be a nudge, that if a lot of people are saying, I enjoy this coffee shop and I like it on Facebook, it does have a bit of a formulaic artificial quality. Nonetheless, if lots of people like it, then you might get something like this chart. Okay, without graphics. Sorry, now we're going to have words. It's a feature of the social environment that affects people's choices without coercing them or imposing a material incentive. So a default rule is a nudge. And I'm hoping you are thinking already of areas where there's a default rule that you have chosen for yourself, or a default rule that has been chosen for you that's affecting your life, or maybe the lives of your fellow citizens, and that could be different. There's a lot to be done in rethinking default rules. Disclosure of information is a nudge. Warnings too. Colors and noises are nudges. If a candy wrapper is green, people are more likely to buy the candy, thinking it's kind of healthy and environmentally good, even if it's pure milk chocolate and unhealthy and environmentally terrible. Where goods are in a cafeteria has a big effect on people's choices. Reminders really matter. So if people get textual messages saying that their bill is due, that can have a more significant impact than an economic threat, the mere reminder. Automaticity, I think, is a wave of the future where, with respect to a wide range of things, not merely the payment of bills, but also shopping for goods and services, it can be automatic. You can imagine, can't you, with respect to things you don't enjoy buying, a system where you are nudged to enroll in a program by which those things arrive at your home periodically. And this is something that could be done by the private sector or could be enlisted by government in ways that would make people's lives a bit better. Okay, what is not a nudge? A jail sentence, a criminal or civil fine, a subsidy, a tax incentives, those all have their place, but they're not nudges. And notice, if you would, that nudges are both soft paternalism, meaning they don't have bite, you can say no, and they are a form of means paternalism rather than ends paternalism. They're designed to help you make your own choices about how to serve your ends, not the government's and not anyone else's. So we could imagine a 2x2 chart, means paternalism, ends paternalism, soft and hard and ends is a little like nations that don't respect freedom. Soft and means are maximally protective of freedom. A small tax on behavior is not a nudge, but it can have a big effect, and it belongs in the same family as a nudge. So if there's a tax that says if you engage in certain behavior that's environmentally harmful, you have to pay a nominal fee, that can have a much larger impact than standard economic theory would predict. It's because people don't like losses. Okay, why nudge? Choice architecture is inevitable and it nudges. A little story for you. In the United States during World War II, some of the pilots were having terrible trouble landing their planes. Planes were crashing during World War II when they came back. And there was a question, why are the planes crashing? Are the pilots tired? Are they stressed? Is there something in their psychology that is causing accidents which risk life and which endanger valuable property? And the United States government hired a psychologist to help figure out why the planes were crashing. And something the psychologist discovered early on was it was a small set of planes that were crashing. They were the bombers. The bombers were crashing. Were the bomber pilots stressed? Is there something wrong with them such that they would crash the planes? What the psychologist discovered as he kept inquiring into this mystery was that there was nothing wrong with the bombers. There was something wrong with the cockpit. In the cockpit, the landing gear had the same knob as another knob, which if you pulled that one, you wouldn't land the plane safely. And they were located right next to each other and they looked the same. So it wasn't a pilot problem, it was a cockpit design problem. I think often societies run into trouble because they have the equivalent of a cockpit design problem, and they think it's a problem of poor incentives or unfortunate psychology. The challenge lies in improved cockpit design. And the cockpit is, of course, a form of choice architecture. What the great English philosopher John Stuart Mill did not quite see is that human beings, for all the extraordinary capacity of choice that the brain has, make some mistakes. And we've discussed some of them. Okay, there is a bit of a backlash against nudging, both in Europe and the United States, I think, from a standpoint that we could roughly describe as the left. And the concern from the left is that it's often best to have coercion or economic incentives, and that nudging is a modest tool suitable only for modest problems. So think of that as you would, if you would, as the objection from the left. And I've seen it in Europe and increasingly in the United States. It is true that when an analysis of costs and benefits supports a mandate, then a mandate is worth serious consideration. We're not going to solve the problem of climate change only through nudges. There are other instruments that are required. But there are a set of reasons to think that in many domains, nudges are preferable to mandates and bans. The government or the business may not know best. The government may have its own agenda. Freedom of choice is both an important safeguard against error and an ingredient in welfare and part of human dignity. So if you think of areas that range from consumer choice to employment decision-making, retirement planning, toys for your kids, to allow across a wide range people to make their own decisions is a way of making their lives go better because they often know. And also it's a way of signaling a respect for human dignity, isn't it? And these are not decisive arguments in favor of nudges against coercion and mandates, but they are often relevant considerations, and sometimes they will tip the balance. Okay, do nudges work? Here are some examples. Pleasingly, in this very country, there has been the, I think, very most powerful study of the potential effect of nudges. In Denmark, automatic enrollment in savings plans has a much bigger effect than significant tax incentives. It's worth pausing over that fact, and it's probably affecting many of the people in this room. Here, if people are automatically enrolled in a pension program, even if they can opt out costlessly, it's like a GPS, you're not coerced. That has a huge effect in getting the citizens of Denmark to have money in retirement. Tax incentives, not so much. Now, if you go back to my slide from 1960 to 2000, our little Bible of policy prescriptions, what I've just described cannot possibly be true, that incentives have less of effect than automatic enrollment. But it is. The data are unambiguous. We have a law in the United States which is designed to help consumers avoid large charges from credit cards, in large part through disclosure requirements and default rules. It's called the CARD Act. That is saving consumers $20 billion annually in late fees and overuse fees, and it's in part nudge-driven. There's something called a home energy report, which is being used increasingly throughout the world, where people see how much their energy use compares to that of their neighbors. It's a little like a like on Facebook. The home energy report has the same effect on energy conservation as an 8 to 20% increase in the short-term price of electricity. That's a very powerful effect. Simplification of financial aid forms can have the same impact in getting people to go to college as several $1,000s in increased financial aid. So whatever practice a private or public institution is using, to make it simpler is likely to have a large effect. Okay, the American model in the first Obama term was not to create a behavioral insights team or nudge unit, as there is in the United Kingdom, but to have a number of people in positions of authority to be knowledgeable about this material and to try to use it in order to make people's lives a bit better. In areas that range from healthcare to financial reform to energy efficiency to education to childhood obesity, we see efforts to have choice-preserving approaches that can help people to live a bit longer or to save some money. There's another approach, which is the nudge unit approach, and that has its own advantages. Okay, with respect to default rules, I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. I haven't seen this in Denmark or in Europe yet, but maybe it's here. In New York and many American taxis, you slide your credit card through a credit card payment system, and then it asks you if you'd like to give a 20% tip, a 25% tip, or a 30% tip, or other. 20, 25, 30, or other. Before this system, the standard taxi tip, I believe, was 15%. Now, to put in 15%, you have to do a little work. You have to expend some effort. The result of the default tips has been to increase tips in New York City by 10%. If you're a taxi driver taking $6,000 in a year, that's a $600 raise which comes just from a nudge. There's a lesson there about how a default economic amount or a default option can have a very large impact on behavior. There's a lot of discussion, I know, in Europe and throughout the world about privacy policies on the internet. The default setting on your computer will tend to stick. And a lot of the future of privacy depends on what the default rule is, whether it involves information sharing or not. Professor Reich and I have done a paper called Automatically Green, which works on the topic of environmentally protective policies that can have a big impact just through default rules. And a default rule that is environmentally preferred can have a larger effect than economic incentives. Okay, here's an old website from the United States. I'm hoping that you'll know analogies in your own experience. This is called the food pyramid, and we see someone gender unclear walking to the top of a pyramid. Can't tell if it's a man or woman. There's a little triangle at the top. Is that thinness? If you get there, is that thinness? If you get there, do you die? Is that heaven? It's unclear where he or she is walking. There are various stripes you can see. Now imagine you're a student or a parent trying to know what to eat. What does that green one mean? What are the foods associated with it? Blue. Blue's a good color. Is blue the ones you're supposed to eat? It's most unclear, isn't it? The foods at the bottom, I think, are unrecognizable as foods, but there's something at the lower right you can see, which I think is recognizable. It's a shoe. Does this mean it's good to eat a shoe? Okay, so this is an unhelpful guide. And I think what makes it useful is that often when people resist an idea or a proposal or a bit of advice or a nudge, it's not because they disagree with it, it's because it's ambiguous. So the question is whether some failure by a private or public institution to initiate a change that it seeks is not a product of skepticism on the part of the people it's trying to reach, but instead a response to the fact that they don't understand it. Okay, we replaced the food pyramid with the food plate. This is clearer and simpler, isn't it? It says make half your plate fruits and vegetables, and then you're most of the way home. So a little slogan for you, plate, not pyramid. In many domains, both private and public institutions and parents and employers and administrators can do better if they keep in their mind plate, not pyramid. The idea is to keep things simple and clear can have a far larger effect than something that is maybe impressively informed. This was created by experts, but too hard to follow. Okay, here's a tribute to the power of choice architecture, a study from a large hospital 2 years ago, which took 2 steps to try to get people to eat more healthily. One was a color labeling system, red for unhealthy, yellow for less healthy, green for healthy. And the other was to increase the visibility and convenience of the healthy foods. You could find them more easily and quickly. And the biggest change was among beverages. There was an astounding decrease of 16% and then an additional 11% in consumption of unhealthy beverages just from these 2 simple steps. And there was a nearly equivalent increase in consumption of the healthy foods, the healthy beverages. So the idea is color coding and convenience can have a big impact on choices. Simplification is emphatically a nudge. One of the last things I did in government was to call on all agencies of the federal government in the United States to simplify their requirements, especially on small businesses and participants in federal programs. And my thought is all over the world, there are programs that are available that could help people, that people are not taking advantage of because it's too hard or confusing to figure out how. And a question for you is, in what domains in your own lives have you neglected to participate in a beneficial program just because of the complexity of doing that? And how can private and public institutions increase participation just through making things simpler? Okay, social norms, I noted, are nudges. The First Lady Michelle Obama has a campaign called the Let's Move campaign, which has encouraged companies to reformulate many products, not through coercion and mandates, but through simple nudges. And we know that with respect to distracted driving, if you talk on a cell phone while driving, please stop. That was a nudge. It's dangerous. There are ways to encourage people through using social norms to, if you use a cell phone while you're on the highway, you're probably the only one. No one else does. That's a social norm. Okay, this is a website called data.gov. And the question is whether many governments all over the world might find this useful. What this does is to create availability for the public of data that the government has. Every government has a lot of data about the environment or crime or highway safety or what works well for children or what's risky for children. And that data frequently has not been made available. The government uses it for its own purposes, but doesn't put it out to the public. Now, of course, there are safeguards in terms of national security and personal privacy against certain forms of disclosure, and those are very important. But bracketing those safeguards, there's a lot to be done to make data available. And the beauty of it is that once the data is available, it can be turned into apps for private use. There are apps on my cell phone which involve airport time or child safety seats, which are possible only because of the availability of data. This is a nudge by government toward private sector creativity, and it can be good for the environment, good for safety and health. Also, it can be terrific for the economy. So the GPS was made available because President Clinton unlocked data, and that has been economically beneficial as well as beneficial for a number of other reasons. Okay, is nudging manipulative? I hope some of you have wondered about that question. The answer is no. An energy efficiency label, which tells you about the economic or environmental effects of an energy efficiency product, there's nothing manipulative about that. It's completely transparent. A default rule that increases participation in retirement plans or in green energy programs, that is clear, public, and flexible. It's something that's not hidden or manipulative or secret, and if people don't like it, they can switch. If you get information about your own credit card usage or about prevailing social norms, this is public and transparent. There's a great American philosopher named John Rawls, wrote a book called The Theory of Justice, one of the great works in political philosophy in the 20th century. And Rawls pressed a principle he called the publicity principle, which, to speak roughly, means you shouldn't have principles as a government that you can't state and defend publicly. That's a pretty good principle. And nudging should be subject to the publicity principle. If it's not, it's rightly criticized. If it is, it meets the objection. Okay, here are future directions. It might be useful for every nation to think whether it can simplify what it's doing insofar as it's interacting with the private sector. Steve Jobs, you know, the creative mind behind Apple, he was in some ways a behavioral scientist. His great idea was make it intuitive. Make it beautiful also, but make it intuitive, make it map on to how people already think. He was a great simplifier. There are ways that government, I think, can be more like Apple computers, and other private institutions too, in the sense that even a child can do it. Simple and intuitive. There are more than at any time in the history of the world, a private or public institution can ask you the following question: what do you want? Your credit card company, your employer, your school can put to you the active choice, what do you want? That's a form of choice architecture. That's a form of water, asking you what you want. But it's also the case that more than at any time in the history of the world, institutions can devise a default rule for you, thinking we know, if it's your credit card company, what you tend to like, if it's your bookseller, and we're going to give you default suggestions or maybe even default outcomes which you can reject if you don't like them. So in many areas where you interact with the internet, it's possible to devise a default rule that suits you, given your choices. And a great future direction is to think, when do we want active choosing? And when do we want something very different, that is a personalized default rule, which relieves you from the responsibility of choosing, but which also might be a little scary because it's being tailored by someone else in a way that might be seen to invade your privacy. Automaticity is something we're going to see a lot more of versus in the next 20 years, where to fit people's preferences or to promote their welfare, things come to them automatically. Pelle referred to randomized controlled trials. We probably need a catchier word for that. It doesn't get the blood flowing with excitement. I didn't detect when I said randomized controlled trials that the room was about to explode in applause. But randomized controlled trials are, of course, the gold standard in medical advance, and we need to be doing that a lot more socially. Pelle is, and many others are, trying to figure out what are the impacts of various nudges, what really has an effect and what doesn't. We need to think much more about nudges that will help people do good in the sense of promoting social and moral goals, and do well in the sense of helping them rather than hurting economically. So if we can combine those two, that's great. A little tale in the United States was our Federal Communications Commission was concerned that many consumers were ending up being shocked to see their telephone bills because they went over their usage minutes and they didn't know, and then the bill came at the end of the month and they had to pay much more than they expected, and the same thing happened 2 months later and 4 months later. Human beings are sometimes inattentive, and what our Federal Communications Commission proposed to do was to require a nudge by which companies would notify people you're about to come up against your limit. What the companies did, presented with that possible regulation, was to say we're going to do it voluntarily, thinking that this wouldn't be economically harmful to them and it would be good, especially because it would help people who were probably not economically advantaged. It worked out well. People are now notified. Okay, we are at the tip of a very large iceberg. In terms of what I've discussed, we can see the very top of that slide. But if you see the slide, you can see the rest of it. What we can't see yet is very beautiful. Thanks.
So thank you very much, Professor Sunstein. We're going to take some questions now. And the first one is an easygoing one. You wrote the book together with Professor Thaler 6 years ago. And we have now a British nudge unit, which is doing tremendously fine, doing a lot of good experiments. We have the White House continuing its work on implementing nudges and using choice architecture. And we have, of course, the work in Europe. There's a European nudge network coming out tomorrow. It's launched. So did you ever think about this development when you wrote the book?
No. we thought we had an idea that would transcend normal political divisions. So we thought that the left would be interested in this, and so would the right. And we liked that. But the idea that it would have this degree of effect on government practice, we didn't dream that would happen.
And when you then look, because since we both have work going on in Europe and we have work going on in the US, do you see any differences between the way that it works in the US, the way that nudging is received in the US and the way that it's received especially in the UK? You mentioned that there had been some discussion in the US and also in Europe. Are there differences, or is it the same issues that pop up?
I think it's very similar. In the United States, early in 2009, I'd say, there was very widespread excitement about using behavioral economics in policy among very diverse people. And then it became politically contested in the sense that some people were concerned about the manipulation objection and thought, the government shouldn't nudge, the government should basically be quiet. And that became a debate in the United States. I think it might be a little more intense in the United States than in Europe. But I have seen in the United Kingdom and in Germany a little bit some concerns about unacceptable paternalism. So there is I think this is pleasing. There's a cultural, it's a good debate to have. It's the right debate. Paternalism is correctly something that people worry over. So I think there's been much more commonality than difference, actually.
Okay, and I know that you were once called the most dangerous man in the US, right?
More than once, I think, by the same person.
Due to this debate that...
See, I had hoped, the sport squash? I squash, play with, it's like tennis, but I hoped when I was called the most dangerous man in America it was a reference to my squash game. But I learned it wasn't, because the person who said it said I was the most evil and most dangerous. And you wouldn't describe an athlete as evil. Maybe in the World Cup days you would, but that's pretty harsh.
Okay. Another issue, which is basically one of the main issues of this conference, is how to get science and society to work better together. And you're one of the I wouldn't say the few, because there are a lot of people doing what they're doing, but you have really managed to combine, on the one hand, being an academic, doing great work, and at the same time being active in society, and you worked in the EURE office, right? So how do you balance these two? Do they connect well? Is it easy to both talk to people within the administration and to remain academic? And is it easy to talk to academics while still remaining, informed by regulation?
That's great. And the answer to the first question is certainly no. And the answer to the question is probably no. So my experience was, if you go into government and you talk like an academic, you will not be very popular. Because academics tend to be, it's theory-driven, it's idea-driven. And government is problem-driven. I learned this very quickly. So our president was a professor, so he's an idea guy. But in his role as president, he's trying to, serve the public, not to, bring high-level academic ideas, except insofar as they're useful, so serving the public. So I found, if I'd said in government, there's some behavioral economics we can do, and nudging is a good idea, I think they would have said to me, there's a university in Massachusetts that you maybe should be returning to. So to talk in academic terms, not good. To talk in terms of how to solve a problem, that's good. So if you have a challenge in terms of pollution, and there are information disclosure strategies that can be helpful, that's a good way to talk. And if you have a problem with people not saving enough for retirement or not enrolling in a healthcare plan when it would be in their interest, then we have some tools. So if you get anything from these remarks, I think the idea of nudging expands the universe of tools. And that can be helpful in government. I do find, in talking to academics in the United States at least, they're wonderful, of course, but their understanding of government is a lot like my understanding of what we call soccer.
The real football, yeah?
Football, yeah, meaning incomplete.
Okay. Well, you know, I would love to talk to you for 10 hours, but we have to wrap it up, this session. I want to thank you so much for talking here today. We'll be seeing each other again tomorrow, I know, the whole day. But I would also like you to help me to appreciate and give your thanks to Professor Cass Sunstein for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.